Bill Maher thought he could land a sly dig and move on. But Morgan Freeman's measured, resonant response shifted the room and set the internet ablaze. The dressing room at CBS Television City in Los Angeles was cold, not in temperature, but in its sterile, over-polished sheen, as if it had been scrubbed of soul to make way for fleeting egos. Morgan Freeman sat in a sleek, uncomfortable chair, his hands folded in his lap, his phone screen dimming against his weathered palm, a hand that had carried him from the red clay of Shaw, Mississippi, to the grandest stages of Hollywood. A young assistant had just slipped out, her voice polite but clipped, reminding him he had 10 minutes before his appearance on Real Time with Bill Maher. He drew a slow, deliberate breath, not to quell nerves. Decades of commanding audiences had burned away stage fright, but because the air felt heavy, charged with something unspoken, like the quiet before a Mississippi storm. 2 days earlier, his communications director had called, her tone cautious, practice. They're framing it as a discussion on polarization and civility, Morgan. But Maher's got a knack for baiting guests. He might come for you. Stay sharp. Morgan had let the words settle, offering no immediate reply. He'd navigated too many rooms where smiles masked agendas, where warm handshakes turned to smirks by the end. But the silence when he arrived at the studio set his instincts on edge. No offer of water. No introductions to the other guests. In the green room, muffled laughter from the hallway cut off abruptly when he stepped inside, his presence shifting the room like a sudden hush in a cotton field. He didn't need confirmation. He'd felt this before, in places far less forgiving than a TV studio, back when the world judged a black man's every word before he spoke it. His assistant, leaned through the door, her voice soft but urgent. 2 minutes, Mr. Freeman. Morgan rose slowly, his movements deliberate, the weight of 88 years lending a quiet dignity to each gesture. He adjusted his tailored charcoal blazer, clean lines, no flash, the kind of understated elegance that spoke of a man who'd earned his place without shouting it. He glanced in the mirror, his eyes steady, unyielding, carrying the wisdom of a life that began under Jim Crow's shadow and rose to narrate the cosmos. No cracks, no room for them. As he walked to the set, he passed a gallery of black and white portraits lining the hallway. Icons, men in crisp suits, men with loud opinions, men who never had to calibrate their tone to avoid being branded angry or uppity on cable news. Their faces stared down, frozen in smug permanence, and Morgan's lips curved faintly, a flicker of knowing. He'd outlasted their kind, from Mississippi juke joints to Broadway stages, and he'd do it again tonight. On stage, he offered Bill Maher a calm nod, his posture upright but relaxed, the kind of ease earned through years of holding space, from Driving Miss Daisy to The Shawshank Redemption. Maher returned a half-smile, gesturing to the chair with a glint of amusement, like he was biting back a private quip. The studio lights blazed, the applause sign blinked, the theme music pulsed through the speakers, and just like that, they were live. Maher leaned forward, his grin sharp, practiced. Our next guest, you all know him. Academy Award winner, voice of God himself, Morgan Freeman. A legend, unless emotion muddies the message. The audience chuckled lightly, sensing the jab disguised as a compliment. Morgan tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing in calculation. A subtle shift that spoke of a man who'd played every role from prisoner to president. He settled into the chair, hands resting lightly on his knees, his face unreadable yet commanding, like a preacher about to deliver a sermon. Good to be here, Bill, he said, his voice deep, resonant, like a Mississippi River current, unrushed, unshakable, carrying the weight of a life lived deliberately. Maher's smile tightened, a tell Morgan didn't miss. Let's start simple, Maher said, his tone casual but pointed. Why does everyone feel the need to moralize everything these days? It's all feelings, no facts, no progress. Morgan let the question hang, his nod slow, deliberate, as if he'd been handed the exact bait he'd expected. His response wasn't anger, it was sharper, colder, honed by a lifetime of navigating rooms where his presence alone was a statement, where his voice carried expectations he'd long learned to defy. He leaned forward slightly, his movement measured, his voice steady but firm, each word chosen with the precision of a man who'd narrated history itself. Moralizing, I think you mean standing up for folks who've been ignored too long. People who've been waiting patiently for their turn to be heard. Maher smirked, undeterred, leaning back in his chair. Sure, but doesn't passion get in the way of progress? Too much yelling, not enough results. Seems like everyone's chasing viral moments instead of solutions. A few awkward laughs rippled through the audience, uncertain, testing the room's temperature. Morgan's expression didn't shift, his eyes steady, piercing. I hear you, he said, his voice even, each word carrying the weight of his years. Young people, especially young black men and women, get labeled emotional when they care too much, angry when they speak plain and direct. Meanwhile, someone else can rant, curse on air, and it's called passion. Curious double standard, isn't it? Makes you wonder who gets to decide what's too much. Maher shifted, his posture stiffening, a subtle sign of discomfort. You're making it about identity, he said, his tone sharpening. I'm talking approach. People want solutions, not lectures. Morgan's gaze held steady, his eyes carrying the quiet authority of a man who'd seen the world's fault lines up close. You can't untangle identity from approach, Bill, he said, his voice calm but unyielding, rooted in the memory of Mississippi nights, where survival meant knowing when to speak and when to hold silence. If your community's been overlooked, underfunded, blamed for problems it didn't create, what do you expect them to sound like when they get a mic? Like they're asking permission to exist? The tension thickened, the room quieting, not out of unease, but from a raw, building anticipation, like the hush before a storm breaks. Maher raised an eyebrow, leaning back further, his fingers drumming lightly on the armrest. But isn't that the problem? The mic's a weapon now, not a tool. Every moment's a chance to clap back. Activism feels like a stage. Morgan let out a low chuckle, not amused but because the setup was too predictable, like a script he'd read 100 times in casting rooms and boardrooms alike. It's always been a stage, he said, his voice smooth, cutting, like a blade wrapped in velvet. You just didn't notice when the same people wrote every act, directed every scene. Now someone new's reading the script, and suddenly it's performative. Curious, that. A quiet, whoa, slipped from someone in the crowd, followed by a smattering of nods, a ripple of agreement that spread like wildfire. The camera lingered on Maher as he reached for his water glass, his hand a touch unsteady, a crack in his usual composure. Okay, he said, his voice lighter, trying to reset the rhythm. Let's take the emotion out of it. What's actually being done, policy-wise? Morgan didn't miss a beat, his response immediate, grounded. Depends, he said, his voice firm, carrying the authority of a man who'd studied the world's injustices from both sides of the camera. You mean what's being proposed, or what's being blocked? Maher tilted his head, sensing an opening, a chance to regain control. Explain. Morgan leaned forward, his movement slow but purposeful, his presence filling the space like a quiet command. Take voting rights. I've backed initiatives to expand access. More polling places in underserved neighborhoods, stronger mail-in options, protections for folks with disabilities. That's not emotional. That's structural, practical. But every time it's raised, someone calls it overreaching. Or worse, unnecessary. So I'm asking, Bill, who's really holding progress back? Maher shrugged, his casualness a touch forced, like a man trying to dodge a spotlight. Maybe it's not that simple. Morgan didn't blink, his voice plain, unadorned. It is that simple, he said. What's complicated is justifying systems that work for some while pretending they work for everyone. That's the real sleight of hand. The audience murmured, a low hum of recognition, a sound that carried weight. This wasn't the usual TV back and forth. No punchlines or forced laughs, just two men circling something deeper, and only one looked at ease in the dance. Maher crossed one leg over the other, his smile tighter, more guarded. Sounds like a good soundbite, he said, aiming for levity, a way to lighten the air. Morgan's response was calm, almost gentle, but it cut deeper, like a truth spoken softly. Maybe, he said, or maybe it just sounds different, because I didn't need to raise my voice to make the point. Maher wasn't done. He leaned back, his fingers tapping the armrest once, then again, his smile slipping into something colder, more calculated. You talk a lot about how hard it is for people like you, he said slowly, the words heavy with implication. But isn't leadership about taking criticism without calling it oppression? The line landed hard, not loud, but smug, carrying that unspoken challenge. You're not allowed to call this what it is. For a moment, Morgan didn't respond. He looked at Maher, really looked, not as an opponent, but as a man asking a question he already knew the answer to. His eyes searching, steady, the same eyes that had carried Red through redemption in The Shawshank Redemption. Then he turned slightly to the audience, his movement subtle, acknowledging them without flourish, a gesture that drew them in like a congregation. His voice slowed, deepened, resonant as a sermon delivered under a Mississippi oak. "Let me ask you something," he said, quiet but piercing, his voice filling the room like a hymn. "If I sit here and explain why systems push people to the margins, and your first instinct is to say I'm playing victim, what does that say about how you listen?" Silence. Real, heavy silence. No coughs, no whispers, just the stillness of a truth laid bare. He continued, his voice unwavering, each word measured like a line he'd delivered 1,000 times. "I'm not oppressed because we disagree. I'm pointing out a pattern, but the moment I name it, the conversation shifts to whether I'm too sensitive, not whether the pattern exists. That's not debate, Bill. That's deflection." The camera caught Maher's face, a flicker of unease, brief but undeniable, the moment someone realizes the narrative isn't theirs to control. Morgan pressed on, his voice steady, unhurried, carrying the weight of a man who'd lived through segregation and still found his way to the world stage. "You've built a career saying the uncomfortable thing, pushing back against the mainstream. You call it courage, and folks applaud you for it. But when a black man does the same, challenges you directly, you don't call it brave. You call it emotional. Why is that?" A woman in the audience clapped, sharp and sudden, her hands cutting through the quiet. Another joined, then half the room erupted, a wave of applause that wasn't planned but felt inevitable. Maher lifted a hand, his smirk faltering, trying to wave it down with a strained chuckle. All right, let's keep it civil," he said, his voice tinged with forced lightness. Morgan turned back to him, calm, poised, utterly composed, his presence a quiet rebuke. "I am being civil," he said. "I'm just not being small." That line cracked the air, not with volume, but with truth. It carried the weight of years, of rooms where he'd been measured by his tone before his words, of moments he'd chosen restraint over rage, not out of fear but out of purpose. It wasn't a comeback, it was a correction, a boundary drawn in real time, as clear as the Mississippi sun breaking through a morning fog. Maher let out a short breath, part scoff, part surrender, and reached for his notes, his hands moving faster than before, like a boxer who'd taken an unexpected hit and lost his rhythm. The crowd felt it, not because they picked a side, but because they'd witnessed two worlds collide, and the quieter one, the one rooted in hard-earned clarity, was winning. Morgan didn't push further. He didn't need to. He sat back, adjusting his blazer with a slow, deliberate tug, his movements measured, and waited for the next question, his presence a quiet command that needed no elaboration. But the real shift came after the cameras stopped rolling. As the credits rolled, Ree rushed into the dressing room, wide-eyed, clutching Morgan's phone, her voice breathless with excitement. "You're trending," she said. #2 on X and climbing fast." Morgan raised an eyebrow, removing his microphone with a steady hand, the calm efficiency of a man who'd done this 1,000 times. "Already?" he asked, a hint of wry amusement in his tone. Clips of "I'm just not small" were everywhere. Screenshots shared across platforms, 15-second loops edited into GIFs, memes with bold white captions screaming, "Say that again." The internet was alight, not just with his words, but with the way he delivered them, that unshakable calm, that voice like a storm held at bay. No producers came for a post-show handshake, no perfunctory thanks, just an assistant with a quick, "You're clear," before vanishing down the hall. That was fine. Morgan wasn't here for their approval, and he hadn't been since the days he'd walked barefoot through Mississippi dirt, dreaming of a stage bigger than his hometown's limits. In the car to the hotel, the Los Angeles skyline blurring past like a restless dream, his inbox exploded. Messages from friends, fellow actors, activists, Folks from Shaw who'd watched him rise from local theater to global icon. A young playwright from Memphis wrote, "You spoke for us tonight, Mr. Freeman." An old friend from his Air Force days texted, "Still got that steel, man." But his mother's text hit hardest, her words plain yet piercing. "You were raised right, son. That man thought he'd trap you. He didn't know you." A headline flashed on Ree's phone as they pulled into the hotel. Morgan Freeman clashes with Bill Maher in tense on-air showdown. Morgan shook his head, a wry smile tugging at his lips, the weight of the night settling into his bones like an old ache. "Clashes," he muttered, his voice low, almost a growl. "A black man draws a line, and they call it a fight. Same old story, different stage." In his hotel room, the TV played on, muted, his face frozen on the screen as a panel of talking heads debated his words without sound. One pundit's chyron read, "Progressives lose when they alienate with tone." Another countered, "He didn't raise his voice once. He was surgical, deliberate." Morgan muted it completely, rubbing the back of his neck with a slow, steady hand, the weight of the day settling like dust on a long road. His phone buzzed, a DC area code. He let it ring twice before answering, his voice calm but firm. "This is Morgan." A practiced voice replied, "Ed Ramos, CNN. We'd love you on tomorrow morning for a follow-up segment on your appearance tonight." Morgan paused, his eyes drifting to the darkened Los Angeles skyline, the city sprawling below like a restless sea. "I'll have my team get back to you," he said, his tone polite but final, leaving no room for negotiation. After hanging up, Ree looked up from her tablet, her brow raised. "We saying no?" Morgan gazed out the window, his silhouette steady against the glass, the city lights reflecting in his eyes. "Say we'll think about it," he said. "I'm not jumping for every mic they wave in my face." Social media wasn't just reposting the clip. It was alive, a living archive of resonance. People shared stories of being told to smile more, to talk less, to not take it personally, their words weaving a tapestry of quiet defiance. A high schooler from Columbus, Ohio, posted a selfie with a sticky note scrawled in black Sharpie. "I'm not being small." A single mother from Atlanta wrote, "I've been told to wait my turn my whole career. You showed me how to stand without apologizing." A young actor from Chicago tweeted a clip with the caption, "This is what dignity looks like." But the backlash was brewing, too, as inevitable as the dawn. By morning, headlines had multiplied, each more sensational than the last. Morgan Freeman torches Bill Maher in fiery clash. Viral clapback shakes up late night. The usual digital flair, reducing a moment of clarity to a spectacle for clicks. Cable news panels pounced, morning radio shows debated, podcasts rushed out emergency episodes. Some called him brave, a voice of truth. Others labeled him divisive, too confrontational. A conservative host sneered, "An activist in a tuxedo," as if that was supposed to sting. An old colleague, a director Morgan had worked with in the 90s, posted a vague tweet about decorum and unity. No names mentioned, but the target was clear. Morgan read it, exhaled through his nose, and set the phone down. He didn't quote tweet, didn't go live on Instagram, didn't fire back. He stayed quiet, not out of retreat, but out of purpose. A choice rooted in the lessons of his grandmother, who told him long ago, "Speak truth, boy, but make it count." Instead, he met with his team in a cramped hotel conference room, the air thick with coffee and determination. He made calls to grassroots organizers he trusted, voices from the margins who knew the real work wasn't done on TV sets but in community centers and church basements. Over Zoom, he spoke to young actors from arts programs in underserved communities, their faces bright with questions, their eyes wide with awe at the man whose voice had narrated their childhoods. One, a shy teenager from Oakland, said, "I felt seen tonight, Mr. Freeman, like I could speak and not apologize for it." Morgan's chest tightened, not with pride but with responsibility. The weight of knowing his words had reached beyond the studio lights. That was worth more than any headline, any trending hashtag. He thought of his early days in Memphis, performing in small theaters, his voice the only tool he had to claim space in a world that often refused him a seat. That boy, that stage, was still in him, guiding every word he spoke now. Back in Mississippi, at his kitchen counter in Shaw, the smell of reheated coffee grounding him like the earth itself, Morgan sat as Ree scrolled through interview requests. NPR, MSNBC, independent outlets, even a few conservative talk shows fishing for a spectacle. They're chasing reactions, not substance, Ree said, her voice tinged with frustration. Morgan nodded, his eyes on the horizon, the Mississippi sunrise painting the sky in hues of gold and gray, a reminder of the mornings he'd spent as a boy, watching the world wake up with a promise of something better. Of course they are, he said. That's the game they play. A contact from a voting rights organization called later. A woman with a measured voice and careful words. She praised his spirit, but warned that the press wouldn't be kind, that moments like this could complicate alliances. Translation: you made them uncomfortable. Tread carefully. Morgan wasn't fazed. He'd known the risk before stepping onto that stage, had felt it in the green room's silence, in the way the producers avoided his gaze. What he hadn't anticipated was the subtle shade from colleagues, directors, actors, even a producer he'd once called a friend, all calling for restraint, as if his calm, measured words were somehow reckless, as if his refusal to shrink was a threat to their comfort. That evening at his desk, the laptop screen glowed dimly, casting long shadows across the room. Emails, statements, interview requests. They could wait. He opened his worn leather notebook, its edges frayed from years of carrying his thoughts, and wrote 5 words in black ink. Not loud, just clear enough. He closed the book, the sound sharp in the quiet, like a period at the end of a long sentence. Morgan wasn't chasing cameras or applause, but he wouldn't shrink to fit someone else's narrative either. Not when he was building something bigger. Something that started in the red clay of Mississippi and reached far beyond the studio walls. He thought of his grandmother again, her voice steady as she'd told him, "You don't need their permission to be whole." He hadn't then, and he didn't now. A week passed, and the internet moved on. Celebrity divorces, leaked videos, a new political scandal brewing somewhere else. But Morgan's clip lingered, shared quietly in corners of the internet, with captions like, "This is how you do it." A teacher in Tulsa wrote to him, saying she'd played the clip for her students, not for politics, but to show posture, dignity, presence. "We talk about bullying, but we rarely teach what it looks like to stand up for yourself without yelling." An older man from rural Oregon sent a letter, his handwriting steady. "I didn't agree with everything you said, but I respected how you stayed calm. I've never seen someone take a hit and not throw one back." That was the legacy. Not a debate won, but a standard set. A quiet power that outlasted the noise. Morgan met with interns from small colleges, invited to his Mississippi office by a nonprofit he'd long supported. They sat around a long conference table, notebooks open, pens poised, eyes wide with awe at the man whose voice had narrated their childhood. One asked, "How do you know when to speak up?" Morgan leaned back in his chair, his movements slow, deliberate, his voice soft but firm. "You don't wait for the moment to feel safe," he said. "You speak when the silence feels heavier than the risk." Another, a young man with a nervous smile, asked, "How do you not get angry when people talk down to you?" Morgan's smile was gentle, the lines around his eyes deepening like grooves in a well-worn path. "I do get angry," he said. "But I learned anger doesn't need volume to hold power. Clarity is stronger than noise." The room was quiet, their pens scratching furiously, capturing words that felt like a roadmap. A young woman lingered after the meeting, clutching her notebook, her voice hesitant. "I want to be a filmmaker someday," she said. "But I'm told I'm too emotional. I talk fast. I care too much. They say I'll never be taken seriously." Morgan looked at her, his gaze steady, kind, the same gaze that had carried Red through redemption. "Keep caring," he said. "That's the part they're scared of. Don't let them dim that light." She smiled, scribbling something quickly before walking out, her steps a little lighter, her shoulders a little straighter. Morgan stood by the window afterward, watching the slow movement of cars below, the Mississippi air thick with the promise of rain. The world outside was noisy, but in here, in this moment, it was clear, like the quiet of a stage before the curtain rises. His words on Maher's show had traveled far, but where they landed mattered more. "I'm not being small" wasn't just a viral line. It was a blueprint, a call to every woman told she's too much, every young voice told to calm down, every black person told to soften their truth to make others comfortable. It lived in workplaces where competence is questioned, in conversations where smiles mask dismissal, in rooms where you're spoken over before you even open your mouth. It wasn't about yelling. It was about clarity, about refusing to shrink. You don't need permission to be whole. You don't need applause to be right. You don't need to change your tone to fit someone else's comfort zone. At a community event in Shaw, a woman in her mid-50s, an admin at a local school, pulled him aside, her voice low, almost trembling. "I've sat in meetings where men spoke over me for years," she said. "You said what I've always wanted to say. I just wish I'd found the words sooner." Her smile was tinged with sadness, but her eyes were bright with resolve, as if she'd reclaimed something long buried. A retired pastor from a nearby town left a voicemail at Morgan's office, his voice gravelly but warm. "I didn't agree with all you said, but I respected how you carried yourself. That's how grown folks talk. Keep speaking plain." These were the moments that grounded him, the quiet honesty that outweighed any viral clip, any trending hashtag. They reminded him why that night mattered, not for a clapback, not for a spectacle, but for setting a standard, for showing what it looks like to stand firm without losing your soul. The pressure of being Morgan Freeman wasn't just about fame. It was about being a black man in rooms where power is decided before you arrive, where your words are judged harsher, your tone dissected, your presence a provocation. People say, just focus on the issues. But when your identity is treated as the issue itself, neutrality is a luxury you can't afford. Morgan thought of that when a young intern asked, "How do you keep going when they twist your words?" His answer was simple, drawn from decades of lessons learned in the glare of spotlights and the shadow of doubt. You don't stop. You speak clearer next time, and you make sure they hear you. This story lives beyond the clip, in the reflection it stirred. It's for the teacher in Tulsa who played it for her students to show what dignity looks like under pressure, for the old man in Oregon who saw restraint as strength, for every person who's made themselves smaller to survive a room, stayed quiet not because they were wrong, but because they feared the label. Ask yourself, where have you dimmed your voice to fit someone else's comfort? Where have you held back, not out of doubt, but out of fear? And what would happen if next time you looked them in the eye and said, "I'm not being small"? They'll feel it. Some will respect it. Some will resent it. But they won't forget it. And neither will you. If this story resonates, share it. Send it to someone who needs the reminder that their voice matters, exactly as it is. Speak it out loud if you have to. Because Morgan Freeman didn't just speak for himself that night. He spoke for every one of us who's ever had to fight to be heard and refused to shrink to do it.